right, so we are going to talk for a little bit here about designing for uncertainty and some of the times when it can make sense to use GraphQL as maybe more than just an API. So my name is Andrew Carlson. I work for Apollo, and I've been there for about a year. Been in the dev tool space for the last 3 or 4. Before that, I spent about a decade actually using some of these tools for doing migrating systems of record. If anybody knows WebSphere Commerce or AEM, come find me in the halls afterwards, and we can talk about how great it is to use them and or migrate away from them. So I want to talk today a little bit about the idea of uncertainty. And many of us here in this room actually are some of the fortunate few. We have less uncertainty in our lives in many ways than a lot of our peers. But at the same time, things are still a little uncertain in tech right now. We do still face uncertainty. It's more uncertain than it's been in the past, but we're still building really cool things, and we are here at this conference talking about some of those amazing things. And one of the ways to think about uncertainty through a slightly different lens is that it is a side effect of growth. If things are uncertain, it means that we're growing, or it means that we have an opportunity to pursue growth in a bunch of different ways. So even though uncertainty is this really scary thing that can give us a pit in our stomachs and leave us, in sweats at night, it really comes from a few different things. And many of us in this room feel this uncertainty for a few different reasons. We may have shifting requirements, like we need to build a new experience, or maybe we need to switch out an IDP, move to a different auth provider. Or it can come from the sense of mergers and acquisitions. So whether we are on the acquisition side, or on the acquirer side, or the acquired side, it can still be intimidating, and it comes with all kinds of new requirements, right? We need to integrate an entire API platform, for example, that comes from a separate business, or we need to integrate ours with someone else's. And another one is new technologies. So we've talked about AI in almost every single session that I've attended over the last couple days, even if it's been just like a nod to it. But there really is a new technology that we need to start looking at or adopting, regardless of the tier of the stack that we live in. We're always looking at and evaluating new technologies to make what we do just a little bit better. And this uncertainty, or this growth, is felt, in my experience, really acutely in what I call the seams between tiers. We're just talking about APIs today, so kind of focusing on the space between the presentation and the application tiers, but it also applies between application and persistence layers, right? Systems of record, things of that nature. And the issue with this, or one of the reasons why we feel this uncertainty so acutely here, is that there are a lot of non-functional requirements that exist in this space. We need to think about things like security. So who has access to our APIs and our underlying systems, and how do they have access, right? We're also thinking about API discoverability. How do people identify which APIs are available, how they should use them, and then orchestrating across a bunch of different services, and then, of course, governance. There are more, but these are just a few of those non-functional requirements that are really important. And when thinking about the future, we really don't have the ability to accurately and perfectly predict the future, but we can prepare for it. And one of the best ways that we can prepare for that uncertainty and we can prepare for that unpredictable future is through the use of proper abstractions. Abstractions are something we're all incredibly familiar with. We use them every single day. And it can be very, very easy to use the right abstraction for the wrong thing. In fact, this is a common foot gun that I think a lot of us have probably felt, but certainly we've at least seen in companies. Like, look, we make mistakes, right? Like, we've used the wrong thing, the wrong tool for the job. And this is an example of a post that was made on Reddit just about 2 weeks ago. I literally just grabbed this screenshot. And in this post, I see a lot of examples, and it's not just this one. They're all over the internet, right? I think Daniel just showed a couple examples, right, where we have these vastly differing opinions about not just GraphQL, but other sort of like hype-adjacent technologies where, it's either the best thing ever or the worst thing ever, and there's really no space in between. And I don't think that's a very nuanced way of looking at it. When I look through this post, I see a lot of folks who are maybe using a great tool for the wrong job, or it's maybe just not applicable for their specific situation, but instead there's like this vehement hatred for it, right? And when we're thinking about specifically API strategies and how we can structure our API platforms to be resilient and to be capable of resisting change and actually sort of anti-fragile, right? Like better than they were before. I really think that this versus that, REST versus GraphQL, for example, which, by the way, 1.5 million results, I think that this is the wrong question. I think a better question is actually, how can I add resiliency to my API strategy? Anti-fragility, right? And when we're thinking about designing for resilience, there are a few different attributes that we can apply to this, a few different lenses that we can view this through. One is, how can we offer rapid self-service for the folks on both sides of this equation? For the folks who are adding APIs and adding data to our API platform, and then for the consumer side as well, so the clients who are actually consuming from our APIs. Another one is insulation. How do we create this insulating contract between the two layers? And I'm super glad that this image rendered, because sometimes it doesn't, and it's just like this white box on the screen. But the idea of an insulating contract is sometimes a little bit like annoying to grasp. And so one way that I like to think about it is as a differential in a vehicle, right? And so if we have two wheels that need to operate independently, the client side and the application side, this insulating contract gives us an opportunity for both of those wheels, both sides of the equation, to spin independently from each other. And then magnifying investments, and I can tell you already I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just going to add that next one. So magnifying existing investments means how can we take our existing APIs, our existing services, and get more out of them? How can we make them even more effective and drive even more ROI? And then governance. I don't think that one really needs a whole lot of explanation, right? We need to be able to govern who has access to our APIs, how they're consuming them, and doing so through a centralized place is very valuable for both our teams and our organizations. So there are a few different strategies for this API integration and organization that we've tried. The first one that we'll talk about is client-side orchestration. So this is there are more that came before this, but this is a pretty good example of where we have our orchestration API logic actually baked into the client directly. So it's in the UI code. I helped build a parking application for a popular auto manufacturer a few years back, and we had no less than 30 API requests all sequenced through the UI. And so as soon as we wanted to add a new UI, well, guess what? We needed to duplicate those, right? We started out with a web app, but as soon as we want to move that to mobile or something else, we're replicating that UI code over and over for sequencing those API requests, even though they're fairly common, or consistent across clients, I should say. So if we think about the client-side strategy applied to those four principles that we looked at, it does satisfy the rapid self-service as long as those APIs are accessible through something like an open API spec. Anybody on the team can go ahead and implement them, but it's not very insulating. They're very tightly coupled. And as for governance, well, who knows exactly which clients are implementing each of those individual API requests? It's a big problem. The next one that we'll talk about is backend for front-end APIs. So the general idea here is moving the logic, that orchestration logic, away from individual clients and just separating that behind a separate service. And this does add quite a bit of insulation because the clients don't have that direct orchestration problem, and we can reuse some of that backend for front-end logic. But the problem here is that each client has their own custom API, and when they start to scale, we might start to see a common problem. So on martinfowler.com, a few years back, there was a post where they talked about this, and they said that while the BFF pattern might have originally meant dedicated backends for each front end, it can easily be extended to mean a backend for every single micro front end. Because it's not just individual clients that are doing this, it's all of the micro front end experiences as well. And what you might see is that very quickly turns into a big O problem. And in this case, there are, I think, about 80 of these examples on the screen here, and I just stopped here. There are some clients that we've worked with and seen who have over 600 micro front ends and BFFs that go with them. And this is a huge problem for governance and for everything else. So what we kind of switched around a little bit here. We still have rapid self-service. We still have, and in this case, we have an insulating contract, but we're not really magnifying those existing investments anymore. We're actually needing to create new APIs to do a lot of that orchestration for our clients. And we, of course, lost governance. So how do we move from an O of N problem to an O of 1 problem, where we can reduce the amount of APIs that we have? And I am admittedly a latecomer to GraphQL. I didn't start adopting it back in 2015 when it was open sourced. I'm pretty recent to it. And one of my favorite ways to use GraphQL is not as a separate API, where we need to go ahead and rewrite all of our APIs to move them all to GraphQL. It's actually to use it as a composition layer on top of our existing APIs. So as something that can orchestrate and compose data across REST and gRPC and any other data source. Because it really is more than just an API. It was created in 2012, open sourced in 2015. And since then, there have been several iterations on the problem of how do we actually run GraphQL and operate GraphQL at scale. There was schema stitching in 2017, and then federation in 2019, and we're starting to see even more waves around open sourcing that, right? And so if we look again at those right questions to ask, how do we offer rapid self-service for our APIs? How do we add that insulating contract so that our client teams and our backend teams can operate completely or close to independently, right? And how can we magnify those existing investments? We can do all of those things with GraphQL in some very specific ways. We get rapid self-service through queries instead of endpoints. Right? We just have one endpoint that we're pushing all of those operations through, whether they're queries or mutations or something else. Now, some organizations will have multiple endpoints. They'll have multiple instances of GraphQL, whether it's a supergraph or a monograph. But in general, they'll have significantly fewer than if we had a bunch of different APIs for every single one of our micro front ends. We also have an insulating contract with schemas, and this insulation comes from a centralized specification of the data model and those fundamental nouns that are powering our organization, whether it's product and review or price or anything else. This centralized location where we can agree as both client-side and back-end teams how our data is structured gives us the opportunity to use it differently on the client side and provide it differently on the back end. And this is really powerful because, as Daniel was saying, we can do a lot of independent versioning and things like that are separate and hidden from the client side. We can also magnify investments. So because we can compose data with a federated architecture here, we can actually compose data separately between our independent subgraphs or our backend services and magnify those investments in a way that allows us to reuse all of those existing APIs and existing services. We don't need to rewrite them. We don't need to migrate them all into GraphQL. We just need to pull in the data, right? And we can also do some really great things with governance. So we can govern using declarative policies directly within our schema. There are a few different solutions for this, but we can write these custom directives, which is really interesting because if we have custom directives, and we've annotated our schema with things like @authenticated or any others. We can either write these ourselves or use popular tools to accomplish the same goal. And what this does for us is it gives us the opportunity to apply these policies in a declarative place directly within our schema, as opposed to imperative code inside each of the individual resolvers or where you're getting your data from. And the great thing about this is that since it's managed here, we can pass this down along and do our defense in-depth strategies as well, right? And actually do that verification inside each of these subgraphs or the independent resolvers. So GraphQL does give us this really interesting opportunity to offer rapid self-service and inject some resiliency, to insulate a contract with our schemas, to magnify investments by reusing all of the APIs that we have today, and apply some custom governance through declarative policies, which might leave us all with this little bit of a question here of this version of GraphQL isn't the one that I expected, or the version that I remember using 3, 5, 10, or well, let's say 3 or 5 years ago, not 10. This version of GraphQL isn't what I was expecting, and I would just leave you with one takeaway, which is if you have a problem with that you're facing where you want to compose data across a bunch of different services and you have APIs already, maybe consider looking at GraphQL again, because it might not be quite what you remember. Thank you.